Colin, in your extensive and is, as we've discussed beforehand, covers a range which includes a time range, but your body of work is clearly focused on in the field of suicide as a psychiatric social worker and as a professor of psychiatric social work. This is something that's been very important to you in terms of your focus for many years. So I'm going to hand over you to introduce some of that to us now, please. Over to you.
Well, yeah, as a psychiatric social worker, of course, I work both in child, adolescent and adult psychiatry. And my old prof, Professor Max Hamilton at Leeds University, when I was a lecturer there in 1970, which is 50 years ago, which is ridiculous, he used to say the psychiatric emergency for the mental health field was suicide. And this is always true. And suicide, of course, is a massively complex problem. I mean, how do we count it, for example? What is suicide? Until 1962, to attempt suicide was actually illegal. It was only decriminalized in 1962. So that meant in my early days, in the 50s, in our psychiatric hospitals, because suicide was such anathema to both the patient, their family and society, and the professionals, people were actually locked up to stop them committing suicide. And we used to have the terrible things in our mental hospitals of 24-hour watchers. And that, if that didn't make somebody want to commit suicide, I don't know what does. I got into suicide research almost by accident. But before I should say that, I might almost ask the students, do they think suicide can be a rational situation? And in many, many ways, you can learn from key cases, key incidents in your own careers, if you look back on them. And this was one very dramatic one. As a lecturer in psychiatric social work at Leeds Psychiatry, we all had 1.5 days a week NHS practice, which was a wonderful model because you were teaching medical students as well as psychiatric social work students. And as a lecturer, you would take on cases referred to the department. And usually these cases were really quite extreme, the fact they're being referred to the University Department of Psychiatry. And this is a kind of norm. And one particular day, I remember walking the department, and my professor, who had a really eccentric, I mean, he really was an eccentric guy. I loved him, used to fight with him, and it's wonderful. But he, of course, in those days, medical professors, the only difference between God and the professor, God didn't think he was a professor. I mean, those days are long gone. I thought, oh, Colin, I've got a very interesting case for you, just a case for you. Going on the ward, and it's this bloke, shall we call him Bloggs, Mr. Bloggs, who was a big name in the city, who attempted suicide. So I went to the department, to the ward, and the ward sister came out and said, oh, Colin, this is a dreadful situation. And she quietly told me that Mr. Bloggs, who was a multimillionaire, had attempted suicide. Apparently he'd got a letter to say he'd got 6 months to live. His daughter, who was very close to, had died in a road accident 2 months before. His son had gone to prison because of fraudulent behaviour in the company. The company was now rocking. His wife couldn't cope with this and he left it. So apparently he'd given the housekeeper the night off. He was living in this mansion alone and taking a massive overdose of sodium amytal. And with the dose he would have taken, it would have killed him. By accident, and this is relevant, he was found, brought into the Leeds General Infirmary, resuscitated. And when he woke up, he's raving, how dare you interfere? Max went over to see him, and partly because who he was, but also Max also had patients. And apparently, according to the ward sister, they had a big row. How dare you? And Max said, look, anybody under law trying to kill themselves, in my book, must be mentally ill. Therefore, I'll give you the Mental Health Act as it was then, and I can keep you here. I can actually certify you for virtually for a year, for 3 months, or just for a month. But he said, if you would be willing to see one of my nice young men take my tablets, after 3 or 4 weeks, I might let you out. So this is not a negotiation. No, it is, Max said, it wasn't. So I went to see Mr. Bloggs. The first thing he said to me was, so you're one of Professor Hamilton's nice young men. Well, of course, I was mortified. And I thought, oh, gosh. So I said, look, unfortunately, sometimes I have to apologize for my professor, who is an enthusiast. He means well, but he's not got a very good bedside manner. So look, Mr. Bloggs, can you and I start from scratch? I gather you're having quite a dreadful time. So I was there for about an hour and a half and listened to this poor man's story. And I thought, if I was him losing his daughter, he's got this terminal illness diagnosis with his cancer, his son's in prison, gosh, why not? So I went back over to the department, had a big row with Max, and he said, look, you will do as you're told, etc. This man is trying to kill himself. We're there to offer a hand. And at that moment in time, that first interview, I thought this man's behavior might have been rational because he was in pain, acute pain. Because I'm much, much younger in those days. I'm only in my 30s. Some months later, Max came into my office, gave me a letter and said, oh, Colin, there's a letter here, it includes you. Now, Max never apologized. He would argue with you, then suggest that, yes, he'd listen to your argument and perhaps you had a point of view. But he would never say he was wrong. He would never apologize. After all, he was a professor. And there it was in the letter. Dear Professor Hamilton and Colin, thank you so much. I've got just some months left. The pain is bearable. Life is wonderful. I must have been mad. Thank you both very much. That letter changed my view about suicide for the rest of my career. Because it made me realize that suicide for many people seems to be the only alternative, the only option they've got. And I think as a professional psychiatric social, or as a professional social worker, we have to recognize the acute, overwhelming pain the client, the patient, the service user is feeling, but there might be an alternative. Now, whilst I personally favor the idea of physician-assisted dying, in terms of suicide, no, I feel as a psychiatric social worker, thinking of Mr. Bloggs and other cases and other incidents where people, they thought they wanted to die, but then actually would go on to the end. I feel suicide because, and this is not an advert because I haven't rewritten the book, but we did a book, was perhaps the best book I did, and it really reflects about suicide. Suicide is the ultimate rejection. So the person who's killing themselves feels rejected by society, feels rejected by people who might have helped them. First, they feel rejected by their family and society, but then society and their family feel rejected. And I think the thing is about suicides, you almost have to break it up and say, who's dying? And what's the relationship of that person who might be dying or dying? Is it, and now I'm going to say for some students, because let's face it, most human beings, and particularly people, I think like social workers, like hopefully doctors and people with sensitivity, will sometimes consider Yeah, they may have actually transited, particularly in adolescence and early adulthood, might have thought about suicide, or indeed some of us have experienced this situation. But when somebody dies, is it the brother who's died, or the sister? Is it the mother? Or, God help us, is it the child? I know as social workers, the big issue on the social work agenda is child protection. And as you know, Richard, your work and my research work has shown that child abuse related deaths have never been lower since records began. This may surprise our student body, but for every child abuse related death in Britain today, there's something like 20 young people suicide. For me, that's 15 to 34. If you look at the numbers, every year since 9/11, 2001, when 2,997 people were brutally killed, it was an atrocity. In Britain, there's been more than 4,000 suicides every year. For example, since that period, there's been 11,000 suicides, which means there's virtually, for young people, there's 2 a week. No, sorry, 3 a week. And if it's a suicide in an age group 15 to 34, there are grieving parents. Now, as a parent and as a grandparent, the nightmare of all parents is that their child should predecease them. How do parents cope when their child, has died by their own hand? And this is just such a tragedy. So for me, a suicide, when I was younger and less experienced and couldn't reflect back on life, my own life and other people's life and my practice, I might have thought they were at peace. But somewhere I feel, have I somewhere failed? And in the book, The Ultimate Rejection, I describe 4 cases which I lost. And I still feel that I lost them. There's no way any inquiry would have sanctioned me, etc., etc. Only perhaps I wasn't able to go that extra mile. Now, I don't think we can win them all, quite clearly not, because one of the worst things about suicide, so often it's almost impulsive. When you look into a background of a suicide, it's that last problem, the minor problem that, the last straw that broke the camel's back, and particularly young people, because the best way to look at suicide is actually go to the poets and playwrights, and that wonderful play Romeo and Juliet. You've got a 16-year-old and a 14-year-old, because when you're young and adolescent, now is forever. Now is forever. So suddenly, I remember, Barry Evans occasionally got me to see some of his patients. He was as you know, he's a maxillary patient, a surgeon, and he had one young lad, a 19-year-old farmer, actually from Dorset. His girlfriend had dumped him, and he's a farmer and got access to guns, and took a gun, put it to his mouth, and then moved slightly, and blew half his face off, made himself blind. And then 3 weeks later, when I'm talking to him at his bedside, he's had the surgery to save his life, etc., and he's crying, and he says, perhaps she wasn't worth it after all. But at that moment in time, his girlfriend had left him. I remember another case of a young girl who had been dumped by her boyfriend. Tragically, she'd taken an overdose of a painkiller. And she's in bed saying, ma'am, I don't want to die, but nothing can save her. So there's mothers crying, yes, I'm crying, etc. This is what suicide really means. So I remember, you learn from strange places. My own grandmother, she was 16, and she's saying she's lost her husband. He was killed in the coal mines. Mother and father, brothers and sisters, but nothing is more bitter than losing a bairn. I said, I didn't know you lost a child, Granny. Hey, you silly lad, I'm talking about your mum, because my mother died when she was 33. And of course, my grandmother was alive, and that was her child. And this is the problem with suicide. So when you look at it, there's these cultural factors. As I mentioned, suicide was illegal until 1962 because the churches, and indeed the Catholic Church, still officially, I use the word officially, say that suicide is a cardinal sin. Now, in the Western world, in the Western Catholic countries, that is, whilst it's still part of the Catholic catechism officially, very few priests would actually take that line. But regrettably, in countries like Africa and Latin America, those attitudes to suicide, that cultural stigma, that cultural sanction is still there. So that we did some research on suicide in young women, 15 to 24, really young women, to find in Latin America, they'd got hidden suicides in their undetermined death related to pregnancy, an unwanted pregnancy, because of course illegitimacy in those countries is still a massive stigma. So the girl in her desperation, and oddly enough, even today in Britain, suicide behaviour is a factor for young women having an unwanted pregnancy. And to see these cultural features, in my younger days, and I'm talking about the 60s and 70s now, and indeed in the 80s, being gay was a factor related to suicide, both gay and lesbian, but particularly male gays, male homosexuals, was massively overrepresented. Believe it or not, Richard, if you look into the research, even in the Western world, young men and women coming to terms with their sexuality and those hidden stigmas, relative, nothing like they used to be. But suicide is still a mental health problem, suicidal behaviour for young men and women coming to terms with their own sexuality. So these cultural factors are very big. Another feature which is really bringing up to date, I'm about to write a letter to New Scientist protesting because people were saying, oh, COVID-19 will bring suicides. COVID-19 won't, but the unemployment next year and in 2021, 22, 23, 24, that will bring suicide. Because a major factor in suicide is long-term unemployment. I've told you this story before, but when we had the Thatcher recession in the 80s, now, of course, most of the students weren't alive then, but Margaret Thatcher was denying that suicide was a problem. And there was a panorama programme with Jeremy Paxman, and he was quoting our research in 1988 in the British Journal of Psychiatry, showing in the Western world, when unemployment reaches, it's almost a critical level, you get sudden increases in suicide. And this is still a factor. So, for example, in Japan's suicide rates had been falling, the rates, and this is where you have to compare a country with itself. So for 20 years, Japanese suicide from the 60s has been falling, and suddenly, bang, along comes the crash in 2008. And Japanese suicide has shot up like mad, etc. Partly because of the tradition, but partly because of unemployment. And Jeremy Paxman said, Prime Minister, new research has shown suicide is related to unemployment. And her reply was, typical lefty trendy Guardian reader. And he said, well, Prime Minister, how do you mean? It's the kind of research that lefty trendy Guardian readers do. But it's true. Suicide and unemployment go together. So what I'm really frightened of, in fact, if you look at peak years of suicide since 1979 to the present, you'll find suicide is greater amongst the under 50-year-olds as COVID deaths are in my age group. 75 people over 75 is 85% suicide, of COVID deaths. And that's true from the WHO figures. So COVID-19, yes, follows the pattern of vulnerability. Mainly it's people over 55 and particularly over 75 who are dying. Whereas in suicides, it's the 25 to 35s and people under 50. So I will make a prediction. I may not be here to see it, but the suicide rates will really increase in 21 and 2022 and 23. And this is a major factor. What does a social worker role? There's a mental health crisis. Of this, there's no doubt. Sometimes you get, shall we call it schizophrenia, or shall we call it the psychoses, where people have ideas of their massive lack of self-worth. The Bible says it beautifully. I'm a worm and no man. You know, in Dante's Inferno, he has the entrance to hell is abandon hope, all you enter here. And it's this abandonment that life can be different, so that the pain, and I use the word deliberately, the psychosocial pain that person is feeling for whatever reason, is acute. And if they don't think there's a light at the end of the tunnel, that's really despair. I am a worm and no man, and they can't do anything about it. So severe depression classically can be involved with suicide. And then, of course, you've got the horrors of delusional ideas in schizophrenia and psychosis. Thinking of the link between suicide and child protection. You know, you and I have, we will talk again about that in greater depth. But one classic example here in Southampton was this man, illusion that he was a man from Islamic background, a Muslim, and we read his diaries after he died. He had this delusion that Shaitan, the devil, was going to corrupt good Muslims by giving their children HIV. So what he got, and what you hear now, is the delusions are always current. The delusions, when people have, putting it bluntly, psychotic or mad ideas, it reflects the times. So yes, it's the internet talking. It's conspiracies. It's aliens coming to get at them. It's the television talking to them. It's their laptop is talking back to them. Things like this. It's always current. So this guy was terrified about HIV. So in his despair and love, he killed his children and his wife, and then himself. I once had a case which, well, actually it was the end case because I had to pick up the pieces when it had all happened. I was trying to work with the family and the mother. This mother got this delusion because she's a Christian person, and she was convinced that the devil was taking over and was going to take over her children. She went to a prayer meeting, and they had a prayer meeting, and suddenly she realized the devil had been cast out and so forth. When she went home, the child was giving her some lip, and she realized the devil had gone back into the child. So the child pulled the child's tongue out. Can you imagine when the woman kind of semi-recovered, the depression she felt because she didn't realize what she'd done? So this is where that madness is so obvious, where it is clearly delusional and depression. So clearly mental illness and suicide have often gone together, but it's not always mental illness, and that's the great problem. So the social worker's role is always seeking the positives in the client's situation, the patient situation, and where you can, crucially, see where the pressure points are. So the first job of any social worker is to try to relieve the pressure that these people are feeling, but also be willing to think about, have you thought of hurting yourself? Your client will tell you, your patient will tell you the situation is dire and difficult and everything else, and you will feel, oh my God, yes it is. So one of the things you need to find out is, oh, John, Mary, this must be so difficult. Have you ever thought of hurting yourself? That's almost giving them an allowance to talk about it. Because here's a paradox. People in these despairing situations also feel the stigma of what they're going through. One of the things I have to teach psychiatrists, and it's something they've never thought about. An old colleague of mine, Agnes Miles, a wonderful sociologist, she did a book on women's thoughts of mental illness. And the worst thing that women who are mentally ill feel, the worst thing is when they're referred to a consultant psychiatrist. Does that mean I'm mad? So, you know, to cross that threshold, to seek mental health help, is a massive thing for people to do. And we professionals don't see that because, of course, it's our bread and butter, people are referred to, and we mean well. But actually, in one sense, when they first meet us, certainly in the mental health field, we're confirming them in their stigma. And we have to remember that we may not feel mental illness is stigmatized, etc. But most of our clients, our patients, our service users will. And when you tell that to a psychiatrist, they're amazed that they think, but we're wanting to help them. But the fact they had to cross that boundary.
Such a good point. Such a good point.
And of course, as you know, in your child protection field, we come wanting to help, but as we come, we're first seen probably as the enemy. So you aim to say to the patient, can I help you? Have you ever thought of hurting yourself? And then you get the thing. And of course, then you've got this problem, and it is a problem, where you're doing an assessment, but you may have to want to control because you care. Because if that person is psychotic, and of course the approved mental health worker understands this, you are on behalf of the patient, but you may actually have to think, do I have to consider a compulsory admission? Now, I haven't done a compulsory admission for more than 50 years. I took great pride to convince my patient, my client, that I was there on their side. But I'll tell you a case which I lost. This is a young man, this is in the 60s. We didn't know much about transgender. This was something entirely new. Entirely new. And this young man taught me all I needed to know about transgender. But he was my first genuine patient of transgender. And he was desperate. He explained he was a woman in a man's body. Now, we'd vaguely heard about possible surgery and things like this, but in the middle 60s, as is today, if people want restorative or transition surgery, they have to go through psychiatric assessment to make sure they understand what's happening, etc., etc. So we got him referred to a London clinic and so on, but I was very worried about him, so I persuaded him to be admitted to hospital. And I went to see him one evening, and at the door, the nurses met me at the nursing stable, and somebody made a joke, and I'm afraid I laughed because it was funny. And unfortunately, the lad was on the stairs and hearing this, and he screamed at me, I thought you were different, you're no just like the rest. And of course I was mortified, so I went to see him. I finally got into his room and sat down, and I truly apologized and explained to him I'd never met anybody like him before, and I wanted to help. I did understand that he was in this dilemma, and look, we got the referral. We're sincere, we've got the referral. It will happen, but we have to go through this process because the decision you want to take is a massive decision. So I thought I got there. That night, at 3 o'clock in the morning, he left his room, found an old glass urinal, smashed it, and cut his throat. That was the client I felt I'd lost. I thought I'd left him safe. I thought I'd left him. You don't win them all. And I think it's important for our fellow colleagues to realise that somebody has experienced and has a professorial title of psychiatric social work. Sometimes it didn't work out right. It didn't work out right. And of course, I've never forgotten that. And I'll share two other things with you about suicide with my young colleagues starting their careers. There's two really hideous interviews in psychiatric social work in the suicide situation. I've mentioned earlier this dilemma where you're trying to make an assessment. There are threats, there are stresses, and I want to emphasize it. There are stresses which might be employment, might be relationships, or lack of breakdown of relationships. It may be all sexual dilemmas and things like this, and so forth. Then you look for safeguarding, or if you like, protective factors. And one great thing is for women that they have children. And yeah, I've used this very often when women are telling me they should die, etc., etc. But no, I and your children, they wouldn't, etc. So women having children is a protective factor. So in your assessment interview, you're looking for stress factors and how can we, the social work or the service, reduce those stress factors. And then you look for protective factors. You to sleep at night when you've left your client. But the second worst interview is when the patient has attempted suicide, got involved with serious self-harm and ends up in hospital, and you're going to see them. In one sense, you, the social worker, feel a bit of a failure because you didn't want them to do it and they've done it. But the patient is sat in bed. I can't even kill myself. I'm so bloody hopeless, I can't even kill myself. So there you're sitting, the patient might be in bed or is now closed, and you have got an interview room and you're sitting there. And yeah, there you've got this even more acute interview to do, is how, quote, serious was it? And what risk is there? So do we now section them, do we keep them in hospital? And here's Richard. As you know, I do a lot of counting of suicides to see whether services are going up or down, or whether unemployment, and the unemployment link in suicide is irrefutable. So we'll have suicides next year. One of the impacts of COVID will be increased suicide in people under 50, and particularly young people whose situation has been wrecked. And that is, at the time, they intended to die, but the method they used wasn't lethal enough. Paradoxically, somebody who was almost kind of deliberate self-harming, which gives the people a kind of relief. And we have to understand the dynamics and the biological psychosocial factors. Actually, giving yourself pain sometimes gives you an emotional release. And we have to understand that that's true. Seems irrational, but it actually works. We can understand it. And and indeed, there's something called, counter pain in a form of treatment. But then they used a method which is lethal. So perhaps they didn't intend to die. What they're really looking for was relief. So when you're trying to assess how serious is this attempt, in one sense, you can never be comfortable with it. And of course, every patient, and you and I know this is true, every situation is different. And of course, tomorrow will make the patient's situation different, etc. But then to try to assess, when the patient's in hospital, when is it safe to get them home? And in this sense, you're the kind of semi-policeman rather than the kind of social worker. So you've got to be willing to make tough judgments. Now, we as social workers, if we have one thing we bring different to so many other disciplines, is we are taught not to be judgmental. Now, being judgmental, I could judge this government, but I'll keep off that. Mustn't try to lighten the pretty hour. It's been pretty grim, I realise this. But we mustn't be judgmental, but that doesn't mean to say we must not make judgments. So sometimes we have to take hard decisions. John, I'm sorry. I'm just frightened for you. John, I'm frightened for you. I think you better stay in the unit where you're safe. Because, you know, I don't know how your parents would feel next month if something happened to you. I know how I would feel, but more importantly, how your parents would feel, etc., etc. Because people do care that you're here. At this moment in time, you may not feel that's true, but I promise you they will. So, John, I don't think you ought to be going home just yet. So I suddenly turn into a policeman and I'm locking you up. Not nice, not nice. But I tell you, people will later on thank you for it at that time. Yeah. Go back to Mr. Bloggs.
Yeah.
Thank you, Professor Hamilton. Thank you, Colin. Life is sweet. I must have been mad. But the worst interview, and thank God we don't do many of them, and very often we're not allowed to, is the patient has died and you've gone to see the family. Whose fault was it? You have done everything you could, the services, everything you could, but invariably one of the reasons why this person has died, it was impulsive. Now, I'm not trying to make excuses. I'll tell you another case. I had a patient who was living literally in the next cul-de-sac near my house. He was living within 100 yards of my home, and I was working with him and working with him very well. He had quite severe depression, but we got him on antidepressants, etc., etc. And I've got my daughter. It's winter. She just got a new white coat. Her nana has bought her this lovely little fur coat, and it's a northern winter in the 1960s, late 60s. And I'm going past his house, and he comes out of his house and says, "Oh, Mr. Pritchard, can I have a word?" So I said, "Oh, well, yes. It's Saturday. It's a cul-de-sac. I let Rebecca's hand go," and he starts saying he's a bit worried, etc., etc. And I look around, and Rebecca has gone round, and she's got round this telegraph post, and suddenly her lovely white coat is all smeared. I thought, my God, Beryl will kill me. And I'm trying to look at Rebecca and try to talk to Mr. Smith. And said, "Look, John, look, I'm sorry. Look, I'm sorry you're having a bad time. Look, I'll tell you what, John, look, we weren't supposed to be meeting. Look, what I can do, if you come in, look, I'll see you at 8:30 on Monday morning. Is that all right? There you are. Look, I'll see you at 8:30 on Monday morning." Okay. And suddenly he said, "Oh, no, Mr. Pritchard, look, I didn't want to, it's your weekend, and yeah, I'm going to see him. Oh, look, Mr. Pritchard, I'm sorry, I didn't want to intrude. No, look, I have to tell you, Mr. Pritchard, you've been wonderful to me." And suddenly started saying really nice things. How I'd helped him, how I was one of the few people who understood him, and how I'd got his life back on track. And I thought, oh, that's rather nice. So by this time, Rebecca's coat is a mess. I'm saying, well, okay, I'll see you Monday morning then, John. And I took Rebecca and rushed down to meet Beryl, who of course bollocked me like mad, etc. And then I suddenly was thinking, he was almost saying valedictory goodbye. So I told Beryl, my wife, who was also a professional person, and said, "Well, it does sound a bit odd. Do you think you should go back and go and see him this afternoon?" "Yeah, perhaps I should." So I went and knocked on his door, and I was pleased to say there was no answer, but I was a bit worried, and I thought, well, but I didn't want to kind of make a panic of it. Anyway, that's okay, and I thought it was okay. Sunday morning, the police came and told me that around midnight he turned his car on and poisoned himself. So there you are, colleagues. Your research professor and psychiatric social worker tells you about 2 patients he'd lost. Then going to see the family to try to explain, because what they're saying, Was it our fault? Was it your fault? What could we have done? And I said to you earlier, the ultimate rejection. They feel rejected by their lost ones. And if they're the parents, or it's their brother, or God help us, if it's their father or mother, you know, suicide is the end of a life, but tragically, it's not the end of the tragedy.
Mm.
Richard, I don't know about you, perhaps I've said too much, but I wanted to get over. On the other hand, most of the time, most of my clients did pretty well, as did your clients, because you and I know you were a very, very effective social worker, because I measured your output. And I have to tell you, most of my clients did pretty well, because social work is a great career. And one of the great things is we should stop worrying about sometimes when it didn't go right, and actually think about the times we did get it right. And actually, colleagues, because I'm talking to you now, you young colleagues, most of the time you get in there and you're not perfect. And I have to tell you, well, I'll tell you what my old supervisor said. See, when I was a young social worker, I didn't qualify until I was allowed to be fully qualified until I was 28 in those days. And I looked 18. So I used to smoke a pipe to try to look older. And now I realize, because I was showing willing, my clients would wait until I caught up with them. And you show investment, you reach out to them, become engaged with them, they'll respond and they'll improve. Because, you know, Richard, the whole of all human services, be it medicine, psychology, social work, or the priesthood or teaching, is based upon relationship. And you reach out to another human being and they'll take your hand metaphorically. Thank you.
Thank you, Colin. Thank you very much indeed.